The metal felt cold against Loretta Mae Caldwell's palm as she stood in that crowded Texas saloon, her finger hovering over the trigger. One betrayal. One moment of rage. One gunshot that changed everything. What would you do if your best friend betrayed you in the worst possible way? Has someone you trusted completely ever stabbed you in the back? Tonight, you'll witness what happens when a Texas mom reaches her breaking point, when 20 years of friendship explodes into an act so shocking, it left an entire town speechless. But was her revenge worth destroying everything she held dear? If you're ready for a story that'll leave you questioning everything about trust and revenge, smash that like button right now. Cedar Hollow, Texas. Population 2,847, where pickup trucks outnumber traffic lights 10 to 1, and the nearest Walmart sits 43 miles down a two-lane highway. This is the kind of place where your neighbor knows what you had for breakfast before you finished your coffee, where Sunday church attendance determines your social standing, and where a flat tire brings three strangers to your rescue within minutes. The heart of this community beats strongest at the Cedar Hollow Saloon, a century-old establishment where cowhands, teachers, and bank managers share the same worn bar stools. Every Friday night after the high school football games, half the town crowds into those red leather booths to celebrate victories, mourn defeats, and catch up on the week's gossip. In Cedar Hollow, privacy is a luxury nobody can afford. Your business becomes everyone's business faster than wildfire across dry grass. Whispered conversations at the post office travel to the diner by lunch, then to the beauty salon by closing time. Secrets pass from house to house like borrowed sugar. Everyone gets a taste. But some secrets are too explosive to stay buried no matter how deep you dig the hole. Meet Loretta Mae Caldwell, Lori to everyone who mattered. At 48, she carried herself with the quiet strength that only comes from surviving life's hardest blows. Her calloused hands told the story of a woman who'd worked double shifts at Cedar Hollow Diner for years, never complaining, never asking for help. When Travis died in that car accident 5 years ago, Lori's world crumbled. But she had Weston, her 20-year-old son, her pride and joy, her reason for getting up every morning. Family first, loyalty above all, that wasn't just a saying in the Caldwell house, it was gospel. Raising a boy into a man without his father wasn't easy. There were nights when Lori questioned every decision, wondered if she was enough. The mortgage payments, the college fund she scraped together dollar by dollar, the sleepless nights when Weston came home too late, she handled it all alone. Well, almost alone. Jolene Ramirez had been her lifeline through everything. They'd grown up together in Cedar Hollow, shared first crushes, wedding planning, and the devastating grief when Travis passed. Jolene was the sister Lori never had, the one person who knew every secret, every fear, every dream she'd ever whispered in the dark. When Weston struggled with his grades, Jolene was there with encouragement. When Lori couldn't afford new work boots, Jolene quietly left money on her kitchen counter. When loneliness threatened to swallow her whole, Jolene's infectious laugh filled the empty spaces in that old house. 20 years of friendship. 20 years of shared secrets. 20 years of trust about to be shattered in the most unthinkable way. Lori believed in the goodness of people, especially those closest to her heart. She'd built her entire world on the foundation of family loyalty and unwavering friendship. But Lori had no idea that her perfect little world was built on lies. Thursday started like any other day at the Cedar Hollow Diner. Lori wiped down tables, served coffee to familiar faces, and exchanged pleasantries with regulars who'd been coming in for years. But fate had other plans. A minor kitchen fire forced an early closure, sending Lori home 3 hours ahead of schedule. The moment she stepped out of her truck, something felt off. Call it mother's intuition, call it a sixth sense, but the air itself seemed heavy with secrets. The house stood too quiet, too still. Even her tabby cat, Whiskers, was nowhere to be seen. Lori pushed open the front door, her keys jingling softly in the oppressive silence. That's when she heard them, muffled voices drifting down from upstairs. Laughter. Whispers. The kind of intimate sounds that made her stomach clench with dread. Each step up those creaking wooden stairs felt like walking toward her own execution. The voices grew clearer, more distinct. One was unmistakably Weston's, her 20-year-old son, her pride and joy. The other voice made her blood run cold. Jolene. Her best friend of 2 decades. The woman who'd held her hand through Travis's funeral. The woman who knew every secret, every fear, every dream Lori had ever shared. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, each footfall echoing like thunder in her ears. Weston's bedroom door stood slightly ajar, golden afternoon light streaming through the gap. Lori's hand trembled as she approached, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently she was certain it would burst. What she saw destroyed her world in an instant. There, tangled in her son's sheets, was Jolene, naked, breathless, her dark hair spread across Weston's pillow like spilled ink. Weston's bare chest rose and fell as he traced lazy circles on Jolene's shoulder, completely oblivious to his mother's presence. Time stopped. The earth tilted off its axis. Every breath Lori had ever taken seemed to rush out of her lungs at once, leaving her gasping like a drowning woman. The betrayal hit her with the force of a freight train. Not just the physical act, but the violation of everything sacred between a mother and son, between lifelong friends. The floorboard creaked. Both heads snapped toward the door. Weston's eyes went wide with horror, his face flushing crimson as he scrambled for a pillow to cover himself. "Mom? This isn't... Don't?" Lori's voice came out as a strangled whisper, barely recognizable as her own. "Just, don't." Jolene sat up slowly, clutching the sheet to her chest, but there was no shame in her eyes. Instead there was something worse, defiance. "Lori, honey, let me explain." "Explain?" The word exploded from Lori's throat like a gunshot. "Explain how you destroyed my family? How you seduced my son?" "Seduced?" Jolene's laugh was sharp, cutting. "Oh, please. Weston's a grown man who knows what he wants. Maybe if you weren't so busy clinging to the past, you'd see that." The words hit harder than any physical blow. "Get out," Lori whispered, her voice deadly calm. "Both of you. Get out of my house." "Mom, please," Weston started, but Jolene cut him off. "You know what your problem is, Lori? You're jealous. You're past your prime, and you can't stand that someone still finds excitement in life while you're stuck mourning a dead husband. Comment below if you've ever felt that gut-wrenching moment of betrayal. You're not alone in this." But this was just the beginning. What Lori did next would shock the entire town. Sleep became impossible for Lori that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw them together, her son and her closest friend, wrapped in sheets that she had washed and folded with her own hands. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound ever could. Meanwhile, Bernie Whitaker's phone hadn't stopped ringing. "You won't believe what I saw at the Caldwell place," she whispered into the receiver, her voice dripping with excitement. Jolene Ramirez rushing out of there like her hair was on fire, clothes all disheveled. By dawn, Bernie had called every contact in her phone book, each conversation adding another layer to the scandal. By morning the entire town was buzzing. At the diner where Lori had worked faithfully for years, customers leaned across their coffee cups, sharing theories and judgments. "Poor Lori," some said. Others weren't so kind. "She should have seen it coming," they whispered. Jolene always was trouble. Lori watched from her window as her neighbors gathered in small groups, their eyes occasionally drifting toward her house. The humiliation burned in her chest like acid. She had become the town's entertainment, the subject of their morning gossip and afternoon speculation. 28 years I've lived in this town," she muttered to herself, her voice growing stronger with each word. 28 years of keeping my head down, being the good widow, the devoted mother. And this is how they repay my loyalty." The hurt began transforming into something else, something harder, more dangerous. If they wanted to make a spectacle of her, she'd give them one they'd never forget. Her father's voice echoed in her memory as she opened the dusty box. "Sometimes, Lori girl, a person has to stand up and demand respect. In Texas, we don't back down from a fight." The pistol felt heavier than she remembered, its weight carrying decades of family history. Her great-grandfather had carried it during cattle drives. Her father had kept it for protection during the oil boom years. Now it would serve a different purpose entirely. Justice in Cedar Hollow was about to take on a whole new meaning. Friday night in Cedar Hollow meant one thing. The entire town would gather at the saloon after the high school football game. The Wildcats had crushed their rivals 28-14, and the celebration was in full swing. Cowboys, ranchers, shop owners, and their families packed every booth and barstool. The jukebox blared classic country while Rhett Langston worked overtime behind the bar, sliding cold beers across the polished wood surface. Nobody noticed the figure standing in the doorway at first. Loretta Mae Caldwell stepped into the smoky atmosphere wearing a fiery red blouse that seemed to glow under the neon beer signs. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her eyes held a determination that would have stopped conversations cold, if anyone had been paying attention. She moved through the crowd like a woman on a mission, her boots clicking against the worn wooden floor with each deliberate step. At the far end of the bar, Jolene Ramirez sat hunched over a whiskey, trying to blend into the shadows. Her usual confident demeanor had vanished, replaced by the nervous energy of someone who knew the entire town was whispering about her. Beside her, Weston Caldwell stared into his beer bottle, his young face etched with guilt and confusion. The moment Lori reached them, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Well, Lori's voice cut through the music and chatter like a blade. Look what we have here. The town's newest celebrities. Jolene's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. Lori, please, not here? Not here? Lori's laugh was sharp and bitter. You didn't seem to care about appropriate places when you were in my son's bed, in my house, under my roof. The conversations around them began to fade as heads turned. In a small town, drama was better than any television show, and this was front-row entertainment. Weston finally looked up, his voice barely a whisper. Mom, I'm sorry. I never meant. Sorry? Lori's voice rose, carrying across the now silent saloon. You're sorry? 20 years, Jolene. 20 years I trusted you with my deepest secrets, my fears, my dreams. I held your hand when your marriage fell apart. I brought you soup when you were sick. I considered you family. Every patron in the saloon had stopped what they were doing. Even Rhett had paused mid-pour, a beer overflowing onto the bar. You want to know what respect looks like? Lori continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. It looks like honoring the trust someone places in you. It looks like remembering that some lines should never be crossed. It looks like understanding that when you destroy someone's family, there are consequences. Jolene tried to stand, her voice shaking. Lori, you're making a scene. People are watching. Let them watch. Lori's hand moved to her purse, and something in her expression made several people take a step back. For too long I've been the quiet one. The understanding one. The one who keeps everyone else's secrets while they trample all over mine. Her fingers closed around the cold metal of her father's pistol. Some secrets, she said, her voice dropping to a deadly calm, deserve to see the light of day. The small gun emerged from her purse like a snake from its den. Gasps echoed through the saloon as chairs scraped against the floor and people scrambled backward. But Lori wasn't pointing it at anyone. Instead, she raised it toward the ceiling, her arm steady despite the tears streaming down her face. This is what happens, she declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, when you push a Texas woman too far. The gunshot exploded through the saloon like thunder, sending splinters of wood raining down from the ceiling. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, leaving ears ringing and hearts pounding. For a moment that felt like eternity, absolute silence reigned. Even the jukebox seemed to hold its breath. Then chaos erupted. Women screamed. Men shouted. Chairs toppled as people dove for cover or rushed toward the exits. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with spilled beer and fear-induced sweat. Through it all, Lori stood perfectly still, the smoking gun now hanging at her side, tears cutting tracks through her makeup. Loretta Mae Caldwell. Sheriff Buck Hargrove's voice boomed as he burst through the crowd, his hand on his own weapon. Put that gun down right now. If you're from a small town, you know how explosive this moment was. Drop your hometown in the comments. But here's what nobody expected to happen next. The gunshot's echo had barely faded when Sheriff Buck Hargrove's boots hit the saloon floor. His weathered face showed no surprise. He'd known Lori since she was knee-high to a grasshopper, and he understood the weight of betrayal that could drive a good woman to desperate measures. Loretta, honey, let's put that down real gentle like, Buck said, his voice steady but kind. His approach wasn't that of a lawman hunting a criminal, but of an old friend reaching out to someone drowning in pain. Lori's hands shook as she lowered the weapon, tears streaming down her cheeks. I couldn't take it anymore, Buck. 20 years of friendship and she. Her voice cracked, unable to finish the sentence that everyone in that room already understood. Buck nodded, gently taking the pistol from her trembling fingers. I know, darlin'. I know. He cuffed her with the tenderness of a father, whispering reassurances that this wasn't the end of her story. Meanwhile, Jolene sat frozen at the bar, her face drained of all color. The woman who had commanded every room with her infectious laugh now looked small and fragile. Whispers began immediately, harsh, cutting words that sliced through the air like knives. Can't believe she'd do that to Lori? Always knew there was something off about that woman. Poor Lori losing her husband and now this. Within minutes, Jolene became a ghost in her own town. Former friends turned their backs, conversations stopped when she approached, and the warm smiles she'd known her entire life vanished like morning mist. The bank where she'd worked for 15 years suddenly found budget concerns that required her immediate termination. Weston stood in the corner, his face burning with shame. The young man who'd once walked these streets with pride now couldn't meet anyone's gaze. The weight of his actions, sleeping with his mother's best friend, crushed down on him like a collapsed building. "I can't stay here," he whispered to his drinking buddy Rhett. "Every face I see knows what I did. Every conversation stops when I walk by." Within a week, Weston had packed his belongings into his beat-up Ford and headed for Austin, leaving behind the only home he'd ever known. His departure was quiet, shameful, a young man running from consequences he couldn't face. The legal system moved with surprising mercy. Buck's report emphasized Lori's emotional state and the fact that she'd fired into the ceiling, not at anyone. The judge, a stern woman named Patricia Hendricks, had heard the full story through the town's relentless gossip network. "Mrs. Caldwell," Judge Hendricks said during the brief hearing, "while I cannot condone your actions, I understand the circumstances that led to them. You're receiving a formal warning and mandatory anger management counseling. Consider yourself fortunate that Sheriff Hargrove spoke so eloquently on your behalf." The community remained split. Some viewed Lori as a hero who'd finally stood up to years of disrespect. Others saw a dangerous woman who'd lost control. But most understood something deeper. Sometimes the price of standing up for yourself is higher than you ever imagined. The consequences of that Friday night gunshot spread through Cedar Hollow like wildfire across dry Texas plains. Jolene Ramirez felt the town's judgment immediately. By Monday morning, her position at Cedar Hollow Community Bank had vanished, terminated for conduct unbecoming of our family values, according to the branch manager. The woman who once commanded every room she entered now found herself crossing streets to avoid former friends. Church pews that had welcomed her for decades suddenly seemed full when she approached. The grocery store checkout lines grew awkwardly quiet whenever she appeared. "She brought this on herself," whispered the ladies at the beauty salon. "Sleeping with her best friend's boy? That's lower than a snake's belly." Weston packed his belongings 3 days after the saloon incident. His shame ran deeper than the Red River, and facing his mother's disappointed eyes had become unbearable. Austin called to him, a city large enough to swallow his mistakes, where nobody knew the Caldwell name or the scandal that now defined it. "I can't stay here, Mom," he told Lori through tears. "Every face I see reminds me of what I've done to our family." His departure left another wound in Lori's already battered heart, but she understood. Sometimes running away was the only path toward healing. Yet something remarkable began happening in Cedar Hollow. The initial outrage that had painted Lori as a dangerous woman slowly transformed into something deeper, understanding. Delilah D. McAllister was the first to extend genuine compassion. She appeared on Lori's doorstep with a steaming casserole and kind words. "Honey, we've all been pushed to our limits. You just had the courage to show it." Other neighbors followed. Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop brought fresh blooms. The pastor's wife invited Lori to rejoin the church choir. Even the teenagers who worked at the diner began treating her with newfound respect, recognizing strength in her vulnerability. Most surprising was Bernie Whitaker's transformation. The town's biggest gossip, who had initially spread the scandal with gleeful enthusiasm, began defending Lori in conversations. "That woman endured more heartbreak than most of us could handle," Bernie declared at the post office. "She lost her husband, raised that boy alone, and trusted the wrong person. What she did was wrong, but Lord knows we've all wanted to fire a warning shot at someone who hurt us." The shift wasn't universal. Some residents still viewed Lori's actions as inexcusable. But Cedar Hollow had learned something profound about human nature that summer. People weren't simply good or evil. They were complex beings capable of both terrible mistakes and remarkable resilience. In small towns, redemption is possible, but forgiveness takes time. 3 months after that explosive night at the saloon, Loretta Mae Caldwell began the slow process of rebuilding her shattered life. The woman who once fired a warning shot in rage now found solace in the quiet rhythm of growth and renewal. Every Tuesday and Thursday she volunteered at the local church, arranging flowers for Sunday service and helping prepare meals for struggling families. Pastor Williams noticed how her gentle touch with the arrangements reflected a woman learning to channel her passion into purpose rather than destruction. In the evenings she wrote letters, long heartfelt notes to old friends who lived beyond Cedar Hollow's judgmental whispers. These friends reminded her that she was more than one terrible night, more than the gossip that still followed her to the grocery store. Through their responses, she began to see herself through eyes unclouded by local scandal. Her garden became her sanctuary. Each morning, she tended the soil that had once seemed as barren as her future. The sunflowers grew tall and proud, the tomatoes ripened red and full, and the wildflowers she'd planted created a riot of color that neighbors couldn't help but admire. In nurturing new life, she discovered her own capacity for renewal. The hardest part wasn't the community's judgment, it was facing herself in the mirror each morning. She wrote in her journal about the weight of her choices, acknowledging that while Jolene's betrayal had been devastating, her response had crossed lines she never thought she'd cross. Yet in that vulnerability, in admitting her mistakes, she found an unexpected strength. Slowly, carefully, she began to trust again. Not everyone, and not completely, but enough to let neighbors like Dee become real friends rather than just polite acquaintances. She learned that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, it was about refusing to let it define her future. 5 years later, Cedar Hollow still talks about that night. The story has become woven into the town's fabric, passed down like folklore from one generation to the next. But depending on who's telling it, Loretta Mae Caldwell is either a cautionary tale or a folk hero. At the beauty salon, some whisper she lost her mind completely. No decent woman waves a gun around in public, they say, clicking their tongues. But at the feed store, old-timers nod with respect. Sometimes a woman's got to make a stand, they declare, remembering their own moments of betrayal and rage. The younger generation sees it differently. They understand the complexity, how a lifetime of trust can shatter in seconds, how betrayal cuts deeper than any physical wound. They recognize that Lori's actions weren't about the gun or the spectacle, but about a woman demanding respect when everyone expected her to suffer in silence. The saloon where it all happened now serves as the community center. Children play where adults once gasped in shock. Yet everyone who enters remembers what happened there, how one woman's breaking point became a mirror reflecting their own capacity for both destruction and redemption. But here's the real question this story raises. Lori's story isn't just about one woman's breaking point, it's a mirror reflecting truths we'd rather not face about ourselves and our communities. Betrayal doesn't just hurt, it transforms us. When someone we trust completely shatters that bond, we become different people. Lori went from devoted friend to vengeful stranger in a single moment. The question isn't whether her reaction was right or wrong, it's whether we understand how quickly trust can turn to rage when pushed beyond its limits. Cedar Hollow's response reveals how communities process scandal. First came the shock, then the gossip, followed by judgment, and finally, for some, understanding. Small towns can be both your harshest critics and your strongest supporters, sometimes within the same week. Here's what many miss. There's a crucial difference between justice and revenge. Justice seeks balance and healing. Revenge seeks satisfaction and pain. Lori's gunshot wasn't justice, it was a wounded heart crying out for acknowledgement. Real justice came later, through consequences, reflection, and the hard work of rebuilding trust. Today we don't need saloons for public shaming. We have social media where betrayals become viral content and mistakes follow us forever. Lori's story happened in one small Texas town, but now our towns are global, and our mistakes can reach millions in seconds. Perhaps most importantly, this story shows us that redemption is possible, but only with genuine support systems. Lori didn't heal alone. She needed Dee's friendship, the pastor's guidance, and a community willing to see beyond her worst moment. The people who stood by her didn't excuse her actions, they saw her humanity beneath the headlines. What lesson hit you hardest? Let me know in the comments, I read every single one. Today, if you drive through Cedar Hollow, you'll find a town that looks much the same as it did that fateful summer. The diner still serves the best chicken fried steak in 3 counties, and Friday night football games still pack the bleachers. But where the Cedar Hollow Saloon once buzzed with laughter and secrets, there's only an empty lot now. The building was torn down years ago, yet locals still point to that spot when telling the story of the night Lori Caldwell made her stand. Lori still lives in the same house, though it's surrounded now by the most beautiful garden in town. Her hair has more silver, her smile comes easier, and her eyes hold the quiet strength that only comes from surviving your worst moments and choosing to grow from them. She learned something that night that took years to fully understand. Some scars never fully heal, but they can teach us how to be stronger. One betrayal. One moment of rage. One choice that changed everything. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. You're the real ones who make this channel possible. And remember, in a world full of betrayal, choose to be someone others can trust.